Cool. It's actually working. For anybody who logged on early and you're wondering why we're starting already, we're actually not starting yet. I'm just, when I have a disaster on Ask the Agronomist, my next Ask the Agronomist, I'm always nervous about more disasters. So let me try to get centered here on the screen. So, good morning. For those of you who are on early, we'll give this a few more minutes. If anybody has any topics or suggestions, I've got my list here. And Heather, thank you for being on virtually while you're doing things there about the house. Last Thursday was I have nightmares about Ask the Agronomist like last Thursday. I phoned lots of friends as we were trying to salvage the episode last week, and one of them was Troy Kazire, who Troy actually used to manage the Learning Center here at Monmouth when the Learning Center was up and going. And Troy, no longer with Bayer, moved on to bigger and better things. But he actually helped me start Ask the Agronomist, and he was working here at Monmouth when we kind of came up with the idea and started doing this. And the very first episode that I don't remember the date. I do. There is one thing of significance that happened on that date, in addition to our disastrous maiden voyage of Ask the Agronomist. It was the day that Rush Limbaugh died. And so while Rush was dying for real, Troy and I were dying on our first Ask the Agronomist episode because we had connectivity issues. We had it set up. We were going to do it from actually from the FFA classroom of the high school where he had been the ag teacher before he came to Monsanto. And so we had a cool reason for being there. And he just felt awful that we couldn't make it work. We had a computer issue of some kind that we did not anticipate. We had actually tested it the day before. Everything worked great. We thought we were good, and then it didn't work. So I've had several episodes where technology bugaboos have gotten in the way of executing the program, and it's one of the greatest fears that I have, because I feel absolutely helpless when that happens. And like most men, I detest feeling helpless. So anyway, I might be up on the board here at some point, so we're just going to move the camera around here a little bit, and we'll get started here. So good morning, everyone. Heather is graciously helping out here this morning from afar. So Heather's a cool lady. For those of you that know Heather, know that. So she's cool enough. She's not offended by our patriarchal society that refers to everything as, you're going to man something. So she said she was going to man the chat this morning, and I said, is womaning a word? Because you ought to be womaning the chat. And we decided, Heather and I, that I don't know if Webster's agrees with us or not, but Heather and I decided that womaning is a word, and Heather is womaning the chat here this morning. Appreciate that. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to talk about a lot of crop related things, a lot of harvest related things, a lot of yield issues, a lot of observations from the field. Talk about some fertilizer strategies. Talk about fall burn down. It's that time of year already. So far, our rainfall, at one point in time, my forecast had a chance of rain 6 days in a row in it. But the rainfall chances were like 40-50%, and the amounts were between like 0.05 and 1/4 of an inch. And so far that has produced not much for me. So I don't know how many of you got some moisture over the weekend, but we are desperately in need of a rain just to give people a breather. This harvest has started early and is on a record pace. I've seen some tillage work done already, and it's not even October. So um, people who planted corn early and didn't use fungicide, heaven help them, but they're about half done with harvest in some cases. Soybeans have gotten a good start for those that like to plant early beans early. We have not started at home yet, which I'm not proud of that. I probably shouldn't broadcast that. We've had some issues getting things ready here. So I'm glad I planted corn in May. I'm glad I sprayed a lot of fungicide, and I'm glad I don't plant any early beans because I honestly don't have anything that is in desperate need of being harvested. But as all of you know, it's maturing, drying, dying faster than we can get it out of the field. So okay. Heather or someone anyway in the chat, probably Heather, Googled womaning. It is in fact a word. So Heather and I did not invent a word. We're just using a word that was already invented by other people. But so anyway, just a quick summary. My assessment of this year's crop. So I've got a little crow to eat with some of you because the resiliency of our crop has impressed even me. And I would have to say that while most growers that I have talked to would say that their yields aren't quite as good as last year, that also depends on what your yield was last year. If you set a record on your farm last year, which a lot of you did, I did not. I did not have that good a crop in my area last year, either corn or beans. I think I will exceed my crop from last year. But if you set a record last year, your crop this year is damn good, and it's closer to that record level than I expected. But I don't know that I've talked to too many people that have had a field that was, better than they think a similar field would have been last year, or a particular hybrid. There's some hybrids that are better than they were last year. That's always the case. But this crop's very good, and fungicide management. We're going to talk a lot about that. That's huge. I got my first confirmed side by side over the week. Actually on Friday. I wouldn't have had this statistic last Thursday when I was supposed to be here. So I did have a guy that put a second pass trial in a field. He sprayed his first pass with a high boy. He sprayed his second pass with a high boy. The part of the field that got sprayed one time is very good corn. It's in the 250, 260 range. But the area that they sprayed a second pass on was 40 bushel better than the rest of the field. And his dealer is asking me, well, should we have just waited and put one pass on when we put the second pass on? I said, no, that wouldn't have produced the same result, because if you hadn't had the first pass on, keeping the plant alive, there would have been nothing for the second pass to have saved. So, I know nobody wants to make two pass applications in corn a thing, and I don't think we're going to need to do that most years. So 2021, we needed that. 2025, we needed that. 22, 23, and 24, we did not need that. So I think we can watch the weather. I think we can watch what's going on. I think we can watch disease forecasting tools. I think we can go off of our past experience. I think we can look at the genetics of the hybrid. I think there's things that we can do to help us decide when we need to be super aggressive on fungicide. And I know there's some of you watching that don't really believe in spraying fungicide. And, I kind of thought after 2021, everybody would decide that, yeah, okay, I give up. We need to use fungicide. But some of you were really determined to stick with the plan of not using fungicide. And 22, 23, and 24, that wasn't all that painful. but in 25, that is once again painful. Painful to the point of 60 and 80 bushel differences between sprayed and unsprayed corn. And I think those differences will get greater as we go through harvest, because the unsprayed stuff, if we don't get it out really quick, we're going to start to have tremendous harvest losses on that as well. And those huge yield differences that we're seeing are without the added influence of significant harvest loss. So this is going to be one of those years that you are going to be well rewarded for aggressive fungicide management. Other yield trends we're seeing, early planted, early beans have been outstanding in most cases, and that's encouraging. I hope that we don't have the issue where the early planted, early beans are the best, and then it's all downhill from there. I do think that the weather patterns again this year, and a lot of you have asked, well, you talk about the weather pattern this year. That's been the weather pattern like 5 years in a row. We just don't seem to be able to get August rains and early September rains, like we think we used to be able to. Well, August has always been a dry month, and September has always been a dry month. So a wet August and a wet September is not normal. A dry August and a dry September is normal. But I think genetics of early soybeans have improved. I think there are some really high yielding Group 2 soybeans, and if you've got a high yielding Group 2 soybean planted early, and we don't get a lot of rain in August and September, that bean is far enough along that it doesn't suffer as much as our full season mid and later Group 3 soybeans. And I'm a full season bean guy. Whenever somebody tells me that their 2.6s out yielded their 3.6s, that pains me a little bit, because genetically that should not happen. But because of dryness late in the season, that's how that happens. And most of you, if you're going to plant early beans, you plant them first, and the first beans you plant are generally the best. Unless the first beans you plant are in March, then they're probably not going to be the best in most cases. But in theory, if you're starting to plant beans in April, oftentimes the first beans you plant will be the best. And if you plant your early beans first, it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that your early beans are really good. So if you truly want to know they're good because they're early, you would have had to have had your 2.6 and your 3.6 planted in the same field on the same day, which nobody's going to do that, because that's just going to create a harvest nightmare for you. But there have been some 80 bushel beans, which is better than I expected. There's been some 280 bushel corn, which is better than I expected. There's also been some sub 200 corn in areas that, more disease and corn that didn't get sprayed. We're seeing a few 300s in plots, which means nothing, as you guys know. But, last year we saw a lot of 300s in plots, and we saw some 300 field yields as well last year. I haven't had my first 300 field yield yet this year. I did have some verified 300 average field yields last year. So I'm going to stick with my story that this crop is not, if you had the best crop you've ever had last year, this year's probably not going to be as good. If you were thinking this year was going to be awful, hopefully you're pleasantly surprised. I had been trying to keep my expectations reasonable, and so I have been pleasantly surprised. Now, some of you may not be pleasantly surprised with 265 bushel corn if you thought it was going to be 300. But the one thing I would like to point out is, we had a particular field of corn that died early for a customer. It was a hybrid that did not handle southern rust, tar spot, and crown rot well. Heavy disease pressure field, got sprayed with a fungicide, but it wasn't a stellar fungicide program, but it was sprayed. It died about half milk. So it died about when it should have been chopped for silage. And it still managed to make 236 bushel, which that grower's not going to be doing cartwheels over 236 bushel. He'll probably have a lot of corn that's 260, 270. But the fact that corn that probably lost at least 50 bushel from dying early still managed to make 236, and the fact that the corn that didn't die early, is doing 270, 280, not all the time, but fairly regularly, and had all the hot night stress that we've talked about, all the rapid grain fill, situation that we've talked about. And, even corn that got sprayed twice has got a lot of disease in it. It would have been better had we not had the disease pressure. So, what these yields show me is that, with the start we got off to this year and the moisture we had this year, it would have been unbelievably good had we not had the stresses that we had. And so, while you're wishing maybe it could have been better, the potential was there. The table was set. We could have had more 300 bushel corn in this state than anybody's ever seen before. We could have achieved a yield that it might have taken 20 years for us to beat. I tell people all the time that sometime in my career, which, if I work 40 years, which is, I like nice round numbers, that means I've got 8 years left, God willing and bear willing, to do this. And, I think sometime in my career, we'll have a U.S. average corn yield of 200. And this, if you put 30, 40, 50 bushels on top of every acre in the corn in Illinois and Iowa and Indiana, had we had a perfect growing season. So perfect growing season would be plant like we did, get stands like we had, get off to a start like we did, get the rainfall in July that we did. And then here's what you would change. You'd have cooler nights for grain fill. You would add 2 to 4 weeks to the grain fill period, which means nobody would be picking any corn yet. You would take away the disease and give me more sunlight during, early grain fill. If you could magically do those 4 things, we'd be raising a corn crop that would, might have the market starting with a 2. So the potential is certainly there, for amazing things. I mean, we can plant this crop so fast, we can manage this crop so well. We can just, you can all do everything perfectly. And, when you combine that with good genetics and good weather, crazy things are going to happen. So, let's talk a little more about crazy things that are happening. So yield variability is something that I get lots of questions about. Why do I see 100 bushel variation in yield in corn? Why do I see 6 points of moisture variability in corn across my field? Why am I seeing soybeans that are 8% here and 14% with a bunch of butter beans in them down on the other end of the field? That's all, it's all the same planting date. It's all the same management. It's all the same variety. It's all the same germplasm. So that's the impact of environment. And you might say, well, it's in the same field. So, the weather was not that different across that field. And you're right. It wasn't. Now, actually, it sometimes is more different than you realize. If you want to convince yourself of this, do a little experiment. Put a rain gauge in each corner of a regular shaped 80-acre field and see how much difference there is every rainfall event in those 4 rain gauges. And it'll give you it'll give you an appreciation for why I don't put out rain gauges anymore, and I just use rainfall data from climate, because it's as good as any rain gauge is going to be. Because if you've got 6 rain gauges in one field, you're going to have 6 different amounts in those 6 different gauges. Rainfall is not nearly as uniform as everybody wants to think that it is. So the rainfall amount does actually vary across an 80-acre field. But what varies more than that is the soil environment that those plants are growing in. And you see, when you have stress, now I have had one grower, this is kind of a rare observation he made. He had corn planted in early April. He had corn planted in later in April, and he's got corn planted in early May. And so far, from what he's been in, his early planted corn, he described it as boring. Said, I quit looking at the yield monitor because it wasn't changing very much. It was just super consistent and really good. Now, that's on generally good soil with a good fungicide program. And we'll talk more as we get along here about what it takes to be a good fungicide program this year. But his yields were, surprisingly uniform. But I say surprisingly because typically people are talking about, huge swings in yield and moisture. And when you're getting swings in moisture, that means you've got plants that died early. The wet parts of your field is what your whole field should be like if the whole field was healthy. So generally speaking, unless something weird's going on, wherever the wetter crop is in your field is also the better crop. So the wetter crop is giving you a glimpse at what your entire crop would have looked like had we not had quite as much stress, because this crop, both corn and soybeans, have been hastened towards maturity by stress. If you think there should not be this much corn harvested by September 22nd in Central Illinois, you would be correct. You would also be correct to say there should be more corn harvested than there is in Central Illinois this year by September 22nd. So I'm concerned we don't have enough corn out. In a really good year, we would just be getting started. So this is a very early harvest year, and that's not all due to early planting. Now, we did have a lot of early planting this year. We had a lot of timely planting this year, and we planted a lot of acres really fast. So that is a factor. But it's not as much of a factor as the heat we had going through grain fill and the heavy disease pressure that we've had. Those are the 2 primary drivers of the early maturing crop and the early harvesting crop. But, yield variability is always a thing. So as you're evaluating hybrids, and I would say the same thing about evaluating fungicide programs. So some of you have tried different fungicide things this year. You tried different products. You might have tried different application methods. You might have tried different timings. You might have tried different rates. You might have tried sequential applications. You got to be careful, what you're comparing when you're going to compare 2 things. I had you have experiences all the time where you harvest something at 25% and then you harvest it at 15%, and the difference between what it was at 25 and what it is at 15 is dramatic. Dr. Belo's done some good work on I think dispelling the notion of phantom yield loss. There's definitely yield loss, but there doesn't, his data would suggest there is no phantom. We just have more mechanical loss when crop gets drier. And also, if you're looking at, if you're going off of yield monitor data, I don't know whether your calibration was better at 25% or your calibration was better at 15%. Hopefully, you've got different calibrations for 25 and 15%. But, yield monitors definitely, the way grain flows through a combine impacts how the yield monitor reads. and 25% corn flows through a combine a hell of a lot differently than 15% corn. And so, sometimes you're, high or low or one way or the other on a hybrid, or high or low or one way or the other on a particular moisture, and you dive into something that's different. And, if you haven't recalibrated in that different environment, it's going to be not perfect. Still good information, still good data, still usable. But, if you're going to compare what something yielded at 25 to what it's yielding at 15, might be good to have some scale tickets or some grain cart weights to go with the yield monitor data, just to make sure we're making an apples to apples comparison. But the planting date of the hybrid is going to impact performance. The hybrid itself will impact performance. Obviously, the field will impact performance. The case of soybeans, crop rotation is huge. I haven't talked to many corn on corn guys this year. I don't really have a feel for, how good corn on corn is doing versus rotated acres. Sometimes in stressful years, that's where corn on corn struggles more. But I haven't had many reports. If anybody in the chat has a thought on, how their corn on corn has been relative to rotated ground, I'd be curious to hear that. But certainly for guys who do corn on corn on a certain amount of their acres, when those fields rotate back to soybeans, that's where their best beans always come from. So in the case of soybeans, if you're going to compare two fields or two varieties or two things to each other, you certainly have to be in the same rotation. So you can't compare the yield of beans following 2 or 3 years of corn to 50-50 rotated beans. There needs to be a separate category for beans following multiple years of corn. Fungicide this year is going to be a huge wild card as well. And so I think there's going to be a lot of people trying to evaluate, well, how well did my fungicide work? There's a lot of acres that got sprayed one time that today really don't look like they got much of a benefit from that one application. I think they did. I think they got a huge benefit from that one application. But one application was not enough this year in most cases to give you season-long weed control or disease control. So the timing of that one application you did was critical. The product you used was critical. The rate you used was critical. And in some cases, the way you applied it was also more important than normal this year. If you've noticed the streaks from the aerial applications, which I've seen in virtually every aerial sprayed field, whether it was sprayed with a plane, a drone, or a helicopter, the only difference being the one sprayed with a drone, the streaks are closer together. They're all streaked to a certain degree. Now, the rate of the product you use will affect the streaking. The quality of the application will affect the streaking. The hybrid might affect it a little bit because it's going to show up worse in a hybrid that needed the fungicide protection more. But the streaks are there. We really haven't necessarily changed the way we apply fungicides since 2021 when we first noticed the streaks. What you have to notice the streaks is really, really heavy disease pressure that is killing your crop prematurely. And then you can tell the green streaks are where we got better penetration down into the canopy. And the brown streaks are where, out on the wingtips, typically where things are just kind of floating around. Some of that, just eventually settles down and lands on the top leaves, maybe doesn't get penetrated down in. Some of it might even evaporate on the way down where, you don't really get the full benefit of that out on the edge of the wings. And there's not a lot that aerial applicators can easily do about that. They would have to reconfigure their equipment, narrow their swath width, make more passes, charge you more per acre, and take a whole lot more time getting the job done. Now, if we keep having years like 21 and 25, we're going to have to figure that out, because you would be money ahead to pay $20 an acre for application, done better than to pay $14 an application or an acre for application, done kind of okay. Now, a lot of years, it's not going to make any difference, 22, 23, 24. If all you're going after is a little bit of plant health benefit, if you don't have huge disease pressure, it's not going to matter. But in years where you really, really, really need the protection, that's where it's going to show up. So as you're comparing, efficacy of a fungicide. So, I was talking with a grower friend of mine over the weekend, and he made the observation that a hybrid that he really liked had really good crown rot tolerance, and that's why he thought it was good. And even though he was bragging about my hybrid, I was honest with him that particular hybrid really didn't have good crown rot tolerance, and we actually have to watch crown rot on that particular hybrid. And then he realized that, well, okay, yeah, I did put like a V8 fungicide on that field, which I don't normally do, and then I put a really good fungicide on it at VT, and I didn't plant it until late April, and usually I don't use that much fungicide on that field, and usually I plant it earlier. And I said, well, I think we've just discovered why you had very little crown rot pressure, and then he decided that it really wasn't my corn at all that was responsible for his success. It was his wonderful management that was responsible for his success, and we had a good laugh about that. He said, yeah, he says, don't you know, Lance? He said, if the corn's crap, it's because of the hybrid. If it's really good, it's because of the farmer. I'm like, okay, I will. That's duly noted. Good thing for me to remember when I'm getting into discussions with disgruntled customers. But anyway, timing of fungicide application is going to be huge this year. So just like with weed control, you're better off to be on the early side, and waiting is the bane of my existence. We don't want to wait to spray weeds. We don't want to wait to spray fungicide. The idea that you're better off to wait till all the weeds are up, and the idea that you're better off to wait until you can see some disease, those notions need to be thrown on the burn pile, along with test weight has something to do with yield. Adam, I see you in the chat there. That's why I thought of test weight. I see Adam Henninger's name. I think of test weight. I miss Adam terribly. He's moved on to bigger and better things, but he's still a supporter here on Ask the Agronomist, and he still knows that test weight ain't got a damn thing to do with yield. And amen to that, brother. So anyway, back on the fungicide topic a bit here. So things that made a difference this year: using fungicide, number one; using a really good fungicide, number two; using a full rate of that good fungicide or the bad one. Full rates. Whatever if I can't talk you into using a good one, if you're gonna convince yourself that you can get the same benefit out of $15 that I'm gonna get out of 30, knock yourself out. But whatever you use, it needed to be a full rate, and it needed to be applied early. You got to get ahead of disease. The analogy that Jim Donnelly used when Jim was on with me a couple weeks ago, I love this. If you don't keep the lower canopy healthy, you can't stop that freight train once it gets rolling. Because when you've got the lower half of your crop infested, and this is probably more true in Jim's area than it is in mine because of tar spot. So the other thing you got to remember when you're making assessments of fungicide efficacy and the results you're seeing from your fungicide program, it depends on what your disease pressure is, and it depends on what your disease spectrum is. So southern rust is a really, really bad disease. And a lot of people in Illinois are getting a harsh reminder of that today. Southern rust is like a dysfunctional teenager with a bad attitude. It's bad. Tar spot is like that poor kid's, mean stepdad that, made him the way he was. Tar spot is way worse by comparison. So if you've got tar spot as your primary disease, you have to recognize that, and to stay ahead of tar spot, you got to be early. And we've seen some amazing things this year where, spraying one time at like chest high corn actually worked better than spraying at pollination. And you wouldn't think that. And in the case of Southern Rust, it's probably not going to be the case, because Southern Rust wasn't probably started as early as tar spot was, although we were finding Southern Rust pretty early as well. But you gotta, I don't necessarily like recommending pre-tassel fungicide, but there's probably times that's necessary. When you commit to a pre-tassel program, you're locking yourself into a 2-pass program, in my opinion. So keep that in mind. If you think you want to go out at shoulder high corn and spray fungicide, you're going to need to come back again, and you don't want to wait till R3 to come back. If you spray 3 weeks before tassel the first time, you're going to need to spray at tassel the second time, because you don't want to allow more than 3 weeks in between those two applications. So you gotta guard against that human nature that's telling you to wait. Well, I think it's too early. I want to make sure your residual is only going to last 2 or 3 weeks. So you are not going to have residual activity late in grain fill. And the last thing you want to do is wait till later in grain fill to make that application, just so you can have residual activity after your plant's already infected with disease, because it's not going to do you any good. So, it's going to be a fun year this year to, look at. I mean, I'm getting pictures from people every day. I can pull up some of my own where people went out and sprayed a second pass at, let's say late July, early August, in that 2 to 3 weeks after their first pass. Visually from the air, it looks like 50 bushel, every time. Now, I think there's probably some situations where it's not going to be that big of a difference, but it looks like it is. And no doubt in my mind that anybody that made a late pass in corn is going to be very well rewarded for doing that. But don't come away from that thinking that the late pass is the important pass. The early pass is the important pass, because if you don't make the early pass, the late pass will not save you. If you make the early pass and the late pass, you can save the crop, and that's where the extra 50 bushel ish is going to come from this year. So if you and this trial is out there, we'll have this data. If you had unsprayed versus 1 pass versus 2 pass, or there's different timing studies too. So probably easier to draw this on the board. So let's say unsprayed makes 200. Let's say 1 pass at, so this is 1 pass at VT, makes 240. Let's say VT plus 3 weeks later makes 280. I'm going to say if you'd have made just this pass, so just the late pass, would have been about 220. That's my speculation. I hope I get some actual data to back that up. But the magic of this is all in the timing of the first pass and then doing the second pass. So we gotta quit this. This is still a pretty good program for most years. This is not what you want to do. This is what we need to do in years like 2021 and 2025. And I think this is what we need to do in all other years. And this is what we need to quit doing. And don't start doing this. Would be my thinking right now. Now we'll get a lot more data. So what happened to us in 2022? We did a lot of this work on the heels of 2021 and learned nothing because we didn't have enough disease in 2022 to justify doing any of this. And then people have continued to dabble with it in 23 and 24. And again, we had 3 years in a row there, 22, 23, 24, where this was all you needed. And this didn't look too bad, kind of making people think that, that fungicide thing was a fluke. But 2025 was the year for that one. And so we'll have a lot of good data to analyze at the end of the year, where we can look at different rates, we can look at different timings. I mean, the ROI on anything you did with fungicide this year is going to be wonderfully good. That won't always be the case. I don't necessarily think, I think you ought to just do this. Just do it. I don't think you should just do this, because if 2 or 3 years out of 5, that's overkill. That's a lot of money to invest in overkill, especially in today's economic environment. But we got to be prepared to do this when Mother Nature dictates it. And years like 21 and 25, it did. Now, I have to admit, I was not as bullish about doing this as I now wish I was. I don't know anybody who was, quite frankly, because the reality is when you had to make the decision, were you going to do that second shot? Your corn looked so clean. It looked like the first pass you had made was, you were a genius. You had done everything right. That crop could not have looked better. And then a month later, it's like, oh, wow, that changed fast. And if you didn't make the second pass, then you got to see the change happen in your field. If you made the second pass, the change really didn't happen in your field. And that's where those huge yield differences are coming from. But let's not forget that first and foremost, there is a big yield benefit to the VT pass this year also. And I think, we're seeing lots of evidence of that. I mean, most acres of corn only got sprayed one time. And most sprayed corn is 30, 40, 50, 60 bushel better than unsprayed corn. So I'm probably, this difference is probably bigger than what I've drawn out here, just for the VT pass. Now that's assuming your VT pass was done timely at a high rate with a good product. So if you waited till brown silk and put on a $12 product, it looks about like that. So you can't just say, well, I use fungicide. Well, what did you use? What rate did you use? When did you spray it? And I don't mean calendar date. I mean, what was the growth stage of the corn when you sprayed it? And sometimes we don't even know when it got sprayed. You know when you told somebody to spray it, but you don't know when it got sprayed unless you've asked for as applied maps, and maybe you turned it in at tassel, but it was closer to brown silk before it got done. That's a big difference. A week or 10 days late is going to make a huge difference on the end result. So good, going to be a lot of good things to see this year. It won't be like this every year, thankfully, because this is managing this every year. That's a level of management and a level of expense most of us did not sign up for when we want to become a corn grower. If you want to work that hard, go raise cotton, go raise vegetables, go raise, some other crop. Corn's supposed to be easy. You plant it, maybe we spray it, we harvest it, makes 280 bushel. I sell it for $5. Life is good. This kind of stuff, is not what we're used to. Let's see. Adam, is that a question or a comment? Corn looked clean. Price was crappy. Tough call in some situations. Big believer in river bottoms getting second application more years out. Yes. So Adam's call out was there's environments. So river bottoms would be one. Irrigated ground would be another. A lot of irrigated guys been spraying 2 times for 2 or 3 years now, and damn proud of it. So yes, there are some environments out there where instead of 1 or 2 years out of 5, it might be 3 or 4 years out of 5 that this is the right thing to do. And if this is the right thing to do 3 or 4 years out of 5, well, you're probably better off just to plan on it and just do it. And don't get too cute with trying to second guess. Well, is this the year for it? Or is this not the year for it? Murphy's Law says that, more people will do this next year and it won't be needed next year is what Murphy's Law says. And I've told you this before. My dad told me one time that he said, well, there's a, Murphy's Law. He said, there's a Tarchione's Law. And I said, really? I said, I didn't know that. He says, yeah. He says, Tarchione's Law says Murphy was an optimist. So that's gives you some insight into the environment that I was raised in. So anyway, enough on fungicide. If somebody else comes up with a fungicide question, I'll gladly answer it. But let's slide into fall burn down. So even though we're in the ravages of a drought, my guess is winter annual weeds will still be here. I can't get my cover crop to germinate, but I'm guessing my chickweed and henbit, and pennycress, and shepherd's purse, and mare's tail, it'll figure it out. So do not forget your fall burn downs. If you're looking to save money by pulling out the residual. Don't save money by not doing it. If all you can afford is a dicamba 2,4-D fall burn down, do it. If all you can afford is a Roundup 2,4-D burn down, do it. If all you can afford is a dicamba burn down, do it. Get your fall burn downs out there. You don't have to have residual. The important thing of a fall burn down is to kill what's there the day you spray. Now, the earlier you want to spray, the more important the residual is, because if you're chasing, and the other reason I don't like chasing the combine with a sprayer, when that residue is fresh and fluffy and laying on top of the weeds, I don't care what you spray. If you don't get it on the weed, you're not going to kill it. Dicamba would probably give you the best odds of killing something that it doesn't land on. But you're better off to get some rain, get that residue kind of matted down a little bit, let the weeds grow up through it so you can get them sprayed. And I know all my applicator friends hate it when I start talking about waiting on fall burn down, because the best time to do fall burn down is right in the middle of ammonia season. The absolute last time any retail person wants to do fall burn down. But, like Thanksgiving weekend, Thanksgiving weekend's always a great time to do fall burn down. So it's, we do a lot of things at the wrong time because it's convenient, and that's when we can get it done. But if you want to save money on a fall burn down and you don't want to invest a lot in a fall burn down, and you can wait till November to put your fall burn down on, you absolutely do not need residual in fall burn down. The residual you put on a fall burn down isn't doing squat for you in the spring. The only thing the residual is doing is if you want to spray it early in the fall, it'll keep the field clean if we have a warm, wet, late fall. But keep fall burn down in your heart and in your mind, and try to remember when it's time to write the check how bad you wished you would have done it last spring, because that memory of how bad you wished you had done it last May is pretty far from your mind right now, and trying to figure out how we're going to pay for everything is top of mind right now. So I'm nervous that fall burn down is another practice that some people could say, yeah, I don't think I've got money to do that. I hope you do. Speaking of money, let's talk about fertilizer a little bit. So a lot of talk about fertilizer prices, especially phosphates. A lot of talk about well, do I need to put on phosphates? Can I cut back? Can I skimp? Can I put on a half a rate? Can I put on 3/4 of a rate? What do I need to do? So I guess the first place I'm going to start is, when was the last time you soil tested? Now, if you don't have recent soil tests, that's a bit of a problem because it's so damn dry out right now. I don't really want you soil testing this fall unless we get some moisture, because you're just going to generate a bunch of data that says your soil has no fertility because the fertility is all tied up due to soil dryness. If I went into a 10-minute dissertation of all the things that can affect soil fertility test levels, you'd probably come away thinking, well, I'm not going to waste my money on that. That sounds like witchcraft. It's not witchcraft, but there are things that influence the test results. Soil moisture influences the test results. The lab you take it to influences the test results because they all do things just a little bit differently. The way the soil is dried, the way the soil is processed, the way the soil is handled. The part of the field that you take the test from obviously affects the results. If you pull a 6-inch core this time and a 7-inch core next time and a 5-inch core the time after that, varying the depth of your core is going to dramatically affect the yield result or the soil test results. So hopefully you've got some current soil tests that are good, because with the current soil moisture conditions we have, I'm a little skittish about a bunch of fall soil testing this year. But hopefully we'll get some moisture and get that situation rectified before you need to pull your samples. I'll put a plug in for earlier season soil testing. I'm a summer soil tester, so June 1st is when I try to pull soil tests, and I like that because I think you've got year in and year out, you're less likely to have radically different soil moisture June 1st than you are November 1st. Some years with that traditional fall soil sampling time frame, you could have soil that is so bone dry you can't even get the probe in the ground, or it can be just absolute mud. If you think about June 1st, yeah, it might be wet, yeah, it might be dry, but it's not going to be bone dry, and it's not generally going to be mud. And as best you can, it's nice to soil test with, let's say, moderate levels of soil moisture. It's also best to soil test in the same crop. It's best to soil test at the same time of year. It's critical to have your test analyzed at the same lab. You got to pull samples from the same spot. You got to pull samples at the same depth. So there's lots of things that you need to do to get the highest quality soil test data you can. But once you've got that high quality soil test data, let's use it. And if your high quality soil test data, is telling you that you've got P1 levels of, say, 25 plus parts per million, that would be 50 plus pounds per acre, your need for phosphates on that ground is not that high. Maybe you put on a half rate or a 3/4 rate, or what I would recommend doing is whatever amount you can buy with your budget, do it. I'm not particularly a fan of zero. Now, if you've got sky high test levels that are double what they need to be, if you've got 40 parts per million, 80-pound phosphorus test, you don't need phosphorus for a few years on that soil. So if it's crazy high, yeah, nothing wrong with a zero. But if it's just kind of where it needs to be, zero is going to bring it down pretty fast. Especially if you're taking 280 plus bushel corn off on a semi-regular basis. So use your soil test, use variable rate technology, use yield removal. The other thing I like to do, I like to make annual applications, not semi-annual applications, which means every other year. So kind of the traditional old school way of putting on fertilizer is you put a 2-year spread on a head of corn, and you over fertilize your corn and you under fertilize your beans that way. I like to give each crop what it needs. And so if you traditionally do a 2-year spread, I wouldn't do any 2-year spreading at today's prices. Let's take care of next year. Let's not worry about 2027 yet. Let's hope that maybe something changes in the marketplace, and we can buy phosphates in particular a little more reasonable sometime in the future. Now you got to be careful thinking that, well, I'll catch up later when things get cheap. There's some guys that didn't put any on last year because it was expensive last year. Well, I'm not going to pay that, by God. I'm not going to put any on. I'll put it on next year when the price is right. Well, now the price is 50% higher than it was a year ago, and now you're looking at 2 years without any fertilizer. That's not a good situation to get yourself into. So I don't mind no fertilizer if your soil test says that no fertilizer is okay. If your soil test doesn't say no fertilizer is okay, if you can afford a half a rate, I'd put on a half a rate. If you can put on a 3/4 rate, I'd put on a full 3/4 rate. If you can afford a full rate, I'd put on a full rate. I probably wouldn't be doing any buildup. If you've been on a buildup program, we can probably let that go for a while. I'm a big removal rate spreader guy myself. So, I like to put back, the spot that just made 320, I'm putting on removal for 320 bushel corn on that spot. But I may get chintzy on that this year, and maybe I'll put on 75% or 60% or 50% or wherever my budget dictates I need to be. I'm still going to do a removal rate spread. I'm still going to put more on the spot that produced more, because if you look at those soil tests, I would bet you that the highest yielding parts of many fields have the lowest soil fertility. It is not fertility that's holding yields back in the good parts of your field. It might be fertility that's holding yields back a little bit in the bad parts of your field. And you got to be careful with removal rate spreading because of that fact. So if a low soil test is limiting your yield potential and you do removal rate spreading, you're just going to make it worse. So you gotta watch for that. And what I like to do is a combination of follow the soil test and look at removal, and kind of create a calculation, an equation that takes both of those things into account. And those are another strategy that I like a little bit. I'm going to do this on my own farm. Relative to other things, potassium seems kind of seems affordable, relative to everything else the guy's got to buy. And so if you don't think the ROI is good on phosphates, well, take the money that you're not spending on phosphates and shift it into potassium, because every field I look at and every soil test I look at is screaming for potassium and saying, I got plenty of phosphorus. So we're fortunate in that the nutrient that I think our soils and our crops need more of is the cheaper of the two. So that's a little bit of a good thing. And so if you're thinking of reallocating dollars, maybe as you're reallocating dollars across the field with some VRT applications, maybe you also reallocate dollars between phosphates and potash as well. And don't forget your sulfur. Sulfur continues to be an overlooked nutrient, and it's not getting any cheaper either. But you're probably going to see more of a bang for your buck on average out of your sulfur application than even your potash. And I think you will see a bigger bang for your buck on your sulfur and your potash than you do on your phosphates generally. Can't forget pH as well. So I know there's nothing sexy about lime. Nobody likes to do it. It seems expensive. A lot of guys would rather spend that money on fertilizer rather than a pH adjuster. But if your pH is out of whack, I wouldn't be spending money on fertility till I get my pH fixed. So I guess to back up, I probably should have started there. If your budget is extremely limited, I wouldn't be dumping P and K on a field with a pH of 5.5. First thing it needs is lime, and then we can go from there. And if you've got a field that unfortunately is low in lime and is low in potash and needs sulfur, there's probably not going to be enough room in the budget to address all those issues immediately. Some of this stuff needs to be kind of a long-term project. So if you're comfortable that you're going to be working, that you're going to be on a farm, for the long term, then we can start making those kind of long haul corrections. So with that, that kind of brings me to the end of my list. So appreciate those of you who joined this morning. Sorry for the we're a little bit off sequence here. So this is the makeup episode for last Thursday that did not happen, and then we will be back. Whatever 2 weeks from last Thursday was. So our next episode will be in about 10 days. So the next one will be a little bit close together because we're doing this late makeup episode. I didn't want to wait 2 weeks to share some of these thoughts with you on what we're seeing in yields and what we're seeing from fungicides. Wanted to have a conversation with you about that. So we will be back, not this coming Thursday, but next Thursday. So that'll be a short turnaround for me and you to be back on Ask the Agronomist in about 10 days. So appreciate your October 2nd. Thank you, Heather. She's still womaning out there, and October 2nd would and hopefully God willing, I've got some crop harvested by then. Some of you might be done by then if it doesn't start raining. So it's another crazy year here in Central Illinois. We always, that old saying has not been not true yet. Every year is different, and this one's more different than most. So anyway, hopefully you're satisfied with your yields as well. We've got a lot of plots yet to come out. We've got a lot of plots that have come out. The trends have kind of established themselves. I mean, the hybrids that are having a good year, we kind of know which ones those are. Very, very, very happy with the Cal brand performance this year. I don't like to make Ask the Agronomist a commercial, but we've got a lot of hybrids that have handled this year exceptionally well, and I am very proud of that. So hopefully you're pleased with what you're seeing on your farm, and we'll be talking more about the specifics of that as harvest goes along. So everybody, please stay safe. Most dangerous time of the year on the farm is harvest, and I have bad days. You all have bad days. Everybody has bad days, but let's not have a awfully bad day where anybody gets hurt. So stay safe. Talk to you later.